When a Trump-endorsed judge sanctioned a Texas man for providing water to migrants at the border, it sparked a firestorm that ended with Jasmine Crockett paying the man's fine on the courthouse steps with a bucket of donated quarters. The clang of the coins hitting the plastic bucket, amplified by a dozen microphones, became the soundbite of the week. Within an hour, #QuartersForCompassion was the #1 trend globally. Cable news channels scrapped their planned segments, splitting their screens between live shots of the chaotic scene in El Paso and studio panels frantically debating the legality and morality of the moment. On one network, a commentator called it a masterclass in political theater. On another, an enraged host labeled it a disgraceful stunt. It didn't matter. The image was indelible. A congresswoman, a retired schoolteacher, and a bucket of change, standing defiant against a political machine 40-8 hours earlier. The machine was running at full throttle in an arena in Mesa, Arizona. The roar of the crowd was a physical force, a wave of sound that Donald Trump surfed with practiced ease. He stood at the podium, basking in the adoration, letting the cheers wash over him before leaning into the microphone. "You see what they're doing at our border?" he began, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone that made the 15,000 people in the arena lean forward as one. "They're letting everyone in. But it's worse than that. Now they're trying to stop our own people from protecting our own country." He held up a printout of a news article. The headline was from a local Texas outlet, barely a blip on the national radar until that moment. Texas judge fines rancher for aiding illegals. Trump didn't bother with the nuance, the context, or the man's actual name. He had his narrative. A judge, a good judge, a judge we love, we put him there. By the way, we put him there, he finally did what he had to do. This rancher, they call him, was giving water and food and maps to people pouring across our border. An invasion. And the judge said, no more. He fined him a big, beautiful fine. The crowd erupted. This was the red meat they had come for. It was simple. It was tribal. It was a clear line drawn in the sand. Us versus them. But now the radical left. They're going crazy, Trump bellowed, shaking his head with theatrical disgust. They want to give this guy a medal for helping the invasion. Can you believe it? Boos rained down from the stands. He let them build, orchestrating their anger with a slight turn of his hand. No, we don't give them medals. We give them a bill. We have to get tough. If you give them water, you're part of the invasion. Make them pay. The last 3 words, make them pay, landed with the finality of a gavel strike. The crowd chanted it back at him, the slogan instantly hardening into dogma. In that moment, an obscure municipal sanction in a dusty corner of Texas was elevated into a national litmus test for patriotism. Donald Trump had chosen his battlefield. He just hadn't scouted his opponent. The man at the center of the storm, Samuel Carter, was not a rancher. He was a 68-year-old retired history teacher who owned 10 acres of scrubland abutting a particularly desolate stretch of the U.S.-Mexico border. He did not own a single cow. He did, however, own a deep sense of decency honed over 40 years of teaching American civics to teenagers. He'd seen the desperation in the faces of people who stumbled onto his property, their lips cracked and their bodies failing under the brutal Texas sun. So he did what his conscience demanded. He filled a 50-gallon plastic drum with bottled water and left it under the shade of a mesquite tree near his fence line, along with a few dozen protein bars. He didn't see it as a political act. He saw it as the bare minimum of human compassion, the law, as interpreted by Judge Wallace Thorne. A recent federal appointee, known more for his political speeches than his legal scholarship, saw it differently. An anonymous tip from a local militia group led to a citation under a rarely used state ordinance, originally intended to curb the dumping of waste, which was creatively reinterpreted to include unsolicited provisions that might encourage illegal passage. The fine was $1,000. Samuel Carter refused to pay it on principle. Judge Thorne, eager to make a name for himself, sanctioned him for contempt of court, adding another $2,500 to the total and scheduling a hearing where he hinted jail time was on the table. Samuel had been stoic, if bewildered, by the local ordeal. But when his daughter called him from Dallas, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage, he felt the ground shift beneath him. "Dad, "Turn on the TV," she'd said. "Trump is talking about you." He had watched the rally, his bewilderment hardening into a cold, quiet anger. He wasn't an activist. He was a widower who enjoyed birdwatching and grading papers for his former colleagues. Now, the most famous man in the world was calling him a traitor on national television. The phone began to ring, numbers he didn't recognize. Some were reporters. Most were not. The voices on the other end were full of a vitriol he couldn't comprehend, spitting curses and threats he'd only ever read about in the history books he taught. He unplugged the phone from the wall in Washington, D.C. Jasmine Crockett was scrolling through her briefing documents on her condo's couch, a half-eaten salad on the coffee table. It was nearly 10 p.m., and she was running on fumes, preparing. For a week of what she knew would be grueling committee hearings, her legislative director sent her a text with a link to a clip of the Trump rally. The subject line was just a single word: unbelievable. She tapped the link and watched. She saw Trump preen. She heard the roar of the crowd, and she heard him utter the three words: "Make them pay." Her exhaustion evaporated, replaced by the familiar, cold fire of a prosecutor zeroing in on an injustice. It was the same feeling she'd had countless times as a public defender in Dallas, sitting across from a terrified client who was being railroaded by a system that was bigger, stronger, and didn't care about the facts. Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a lawyer forged in the crucible of Texas courtrooms. She understood the weaponization of the law better than anyone. She saw immediately what Trump and Judge Thorne were doing. It wasn't just about one man and a few water bottles. It was about creating a legal precedent, no matter how flimsy, to criminalize compassion itself. It was about making an example of Samuel Carter to intimidate anyone else who might dare to show a shred of humanity. The phrase "make them pay" echoed. In her mind, it was a bully's threat. It was designed to crush, to humiliate, to bankrupt, not just financially, but morally. She picked up her phone and didn't call a fellow politician or a media consultant. She called her chief of staff, a woman as tireless and as sharp as she was. "Mel, did you see the Trump rally? The bit about the guy in Texas with the water?" "I'm watching it now," Mel replied, her voice tight. "They're already doxing him on right-wing forums." "Find him," Crockett said, her tone leaving no room for discussion. "Get me his name and a number. I don't care how you do it. Find out everything. You can about this judge, this ordinance, the whole damn thing. Dig deep. What are you thinking, Jasmine?" Crockett stood up and started pacing her living room, the city lights of D.C. twinkling below. The anger was coiling inside her, but it wasn't chaotic. It was focused. It was fuel. "He said, make him pay," Crockett said, the words sharp as glass. "Okay, fine, we'll make him pay. But we're going to do it our way." A plan began to form, not just a response, but a counterattack, a way to turn their weapon back on them, a way to take their slogan of punishment and turn it into a symbol of defiance. She was going to that battlefield Trump had chosen, but she was going to rewrite the rules of engagement. For the next hour, she and her team worked the phones, their rapid-fire conversation, a flurry of legal statutes, logistical questions, and strategic planning. They found Samuel Carter's daughter, who, after a cautious 10-minute conversation, finally put her father on the line. Crockett spoke to him, not as a politician making an offer, but as a lawyer outlining a case. She was direct, she was clear, and she was fiercely protective. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady and reassuring, "my name is Jasmine Crockett. I'm a congresswoman, but before that, I was a public defender. I know a raw deal when I see what they are doing to you is not just wrong, it's a perversion of the law, and we are not going to let them get away with it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Samuel Carter, a man who had felt utterly alone just an hour before, finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "What can we do? I'm just one person." Crockett looked out her window, a fierce grin spreading across her face. "You're not just one person anymore, sir. You're about to become a cause. They want to make you pay. We're going to help them. We're going to raise every single cent of that fine." In quarters, she explained the idea, the symbolism, the location, the federal courthouse in El Paso, not in a hearing room, not on a cable news show, but on their turf. On the very steps of the building that represented the justice they were trying to twist. It was audacious, theatrical, and deeply risky. It could backfire spectacularly, making them look like jesters instead. Of champions. Why quarters, Congresswoman? Samuel asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and trepidation. Because it's heavy, Crockett replied instantly. Because it's inconvenient. Because it forces them to acknowledge every single person who chipped in. A credit card swipe is silent and invisible. $3,500 is 140,000 quarters. It's nearly 1,800 pounds of metal. It's a weight. We are going to make them feel the weight of what they've done. We're going to bury them in compassion. The decision was made. The fight was on. Crockett's team began drafting the social media posts, designing the graphics, and booking the flights to El Paso. They had less than 36 hours to pull it all together. As her staff furiously worked, Jasmine Crockett sat down and began to write. She wasn't writing a speech for the press conference or a statement for the congressional record. She was writing a letter to her mother. She told her what she was about, to do, and why. She wrote about Samuel Carter and about the principle at stake. She knew the coming days would bring a storm of hatred and threats that would frighten the people she loved. She wanted her mother to hear it from her first. She ended the letter with a simple line. Some fights you don't choose, they choose you. This one chose me. She sealed the envelope, the quiet act, a final personal preparation for the very public war that was about to begin. The letter was a promise to her family. The social media post was a declaration of war. At 1:17 a.m., a graphic, stark in its simplicity, went live on Jasmine Crockett's official X, Instagram, and Facebook accounts. It was solid black with bold white text. At the top, Donald Trump's quote, "Make them pay." Below it, a picture of a single, gleaming quarter. And then, the call to action. He's right. Let's make him pay. Judge Wallace Thorne has fined retired teacher Samuel Carter $3,500 for the crime of giving water to the thirsty. Let's pay this unjust fine in the most just way possible, together. Let's give them the full weight of our compassion. The post concluded with a link to a hastily created ActBlue page titled Quarters for Compassion and a simple hashtag quartersforcompassion.mel. Her chief of staff watched the analytics on her laptop, a cup of coffee steaming beside her. Initial engagement is strong, she said into her headset, speaking to the small remote team they had woken up. We're getting retweets from the usual allied accounts. For the first 15 minutes, it was a standard, if successful, political fundraising push. Then, something shifted. A major actor, someone with millions of followers, shared it with the caption, "I'm in. This is what it's about." The trickle became a flood. The ActBlue link, designed to collect cash donations that the campaign would later convert to coin, started to buckle under the traffic. The totalizer, which they had set to update publicly, began to spin like a slot machine. $3,500, $7,000, $15,000. The hashtag escaped the confines of political Twitter and went mainstream. People weren't just donating, they were posting pictures of their own spare change. A blurry photo of a car's cup holder filled with quarters from a 20-something in Ohio with a caption, "It's not much, but it's yours, Samuel." A video from a group of nurses on their night shift in a Philadelphia hospital, dropping their change into a communal jar. The story was no longer just about Trump versus Crockett. It was becoming a national, crowdsourced act of defiance. By sunrise, they had blown past their goal 10 times over. They had raised over $35,000. The surplus, the webpage now clarified, would go directly to humanitarian aid charities operating at the border. But the initial $3,500 was earmarked for something much heavier. The logistical reality of their promise dawned with the morning light. 140,000 quarters, 1,750 pounds of metal. They couldn't exactly carry it onto a commercial flight in their luggage. Crockett's legislative director, a man named David, who had a genius for solving impossible problems, got on the phone. His first call was to a bank in Dallas. "I need to make a rather large withdrawal," he began. In coin, there was a long pause, followed by laughter. David didn't laugh back. "I'm serious. I need 140,000 quarters. I will wire the funds immediately." The second call was to a security firm. He hired an armored van and 2 guards to transport the assets from the bank's vault in Dallas on the 10-hour drive to a secure location in El Paso. The absurdity was not lost on him. They were mounting a Brinks-truck-level operation for what amounted to pocket change, a spectacle that perfectly mirrored the absurdity of the charge against Samuel Carter. While Crockett's team scrambled, the opposition mobilized. On a morning cable show, a Trump surrogate dismissed the campaign with a sneer. "It's a pathetic stunt from a radical congresswoman desperate for attention," he said, looking straight into the camera. "Americans are sick of these games. They support President Trump, and they support Judge Thorne for upholding the rule of law." Online, the mockery was more vicious. Memes circulated showing Crockett as a panhandler. Trolls flooded the hashtag Quarters for Compassion hashtag with vile images and spammed the donation link, forcing the tech team to work frantically to filter out fraudulent charges. A local El Paso militia leader posted a video calling for patriots to show up at the federal courthouse. "They want to make a mockery of our justice system," he spat, a large flag pinned to the wall behind him. "We'll be there to show them what real American justice looks like." The battlefield was no longer just rhetorical. It was becoming a physical place, and the threat of real-world confrontation was now palpable. Crockett watched it all unfold from a temporary command center set up in her D.C. district office. She was on the phone, not with donors or media, but with legal experts. She was meticulously dissecting the state ordinance, Judge Thorne's ruling, and the federal statutes governing contempt of court. The quarters were the theater, but she knew the fight would ultimately be won or lost on the law. She had to be prepared for any legal countermove Thorne or his allies might make. They might try to refuse the payment, she told her legal counsel. They could argue it's disruptive. We need a response for that. They could try to slap us with a new citation on the spot. We need a response for that, too. She was preparing for a courtroom battle on the courthouse steps. That evening, she flew to El Paso on a commercial flight, sitting in coach per head, buried in a binder filled with legal precedents and logistical plans. There was no private jet, no entourage beyond Mel and David when she deplaned. The first person she saw was Samuel Carter, waiting nervously by the gate. He was taller than she expected, with the sloped shoulders of a man who had spent his life hunched over books. He wore a simple, neatly pressed plaid shirt and clutched a worn leather briefcase to his chest. He looked less like a revolutionary and more like a man on his way to a parent-teacher conference. They shook hands, and for a moment, they just stood there amidst the airport bustle. I don't know what to say, Congresswoman," Samuel began, his voice quiet. "This has all gotten so, big. Call me Jasmine," she said with a warm smile that instantly eased the tension in his shoulders. "And you're right, it has. That's the point. They wanted to make you feel small, so we had to show them how many people stand with you." They walked together to collect her bag, their conversation turning from the national firestorm to something more personal. He told her about his late wife, about the birds he identified on his property, about the shock of seeing his quiet life turned into a political caricature. She, in turn, told him about her first case as a public defender, about the young man she'd represented who was facing 5 years for a crime he didn't commit, and the fire it had lit inside her. In 20 minutes, they had forged a genuine bond, an alliance built not on political expediency, but on a shared sense of conviction. The morning of the press conference was clear and hot, the sun already beating down on the imposing granite facade of the Albert Armendariz Sr. U.S. Courthouse. The scene was exactly the chaotic tableau they had anticipated. A cluster of news vans, their satellite dishes aimed at the sky, lined the street. A cordon of reporters and photographers, nearly 100 strong, jockeyed for position behind a temporary barrier. Across the street, as promised, were the counter-protesters. There were about 50 of them, a mix of grim-faced men in military style, vests, and angry-looking women holding pre-printed signs that read, "Support Judge Thorne and no amnesty for lawbreakers." They chanted, "USA, USA," in a rhythm that felt more like a threat than a celebration. At precisely 9:45 a.m., the armored van arrived. The two guards, stone-faced and professional, exited the vehicle. They opened the rear doors, revealing not bags of cash, but dozens of heavy-duty plastic buckets, the kind one buys at a hardware store. Working with a few local volunteers, Crockett's team had recruited. They began unloading the buckets, stacking them on a dolly. The clanking sound of the metal coins echoed in the street, a strange analog noise in a digital news event. The cameras swarmed, their shutters clicking furiously. Back in a small office they had borrowed in a nearby building, Crockett did a final check-in. Samuel Carter was pacing by the window, staring down at the scene. He was visibly rattled by the sight of the protesters. "They look so angry," he murmured. Jasmine walked over and stood beside him. She didn't offer platitudes or tell him not to be nervous. She acknowledged his fear. "They are angry," she said calmly. "That's what this is all about. They want people like you to be scared. They want you to sit down and shut up. The moment you walk out there with your head held high, you've already won. Everything else is just details." She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you. We walk out there, we tell the truth, we pay the fine, and we go home. That's it." David poked his head in the door. 5 minutes? The podium is hot." Mel gave Crockett a final firm nod. The plan was set. Every contingency had been discussed. Jasmine smoothed the front of her blazer, took a deep breath, and looked at the retired history teacher who had become the unlikely fulcrum of a national debate. "Ready to make a little history, Mr. Carter?" Samuel stopped pacing. He looked at the determined face of the Congresswoman, then back out the window at the chaos below. He straightened his shoulders, a flicker of the resolve that had led him to put the water out in the first place returning to his eyes. "I believe I am, Congresswoman," he said, his voice finding a new firmness. "I believe I am." Together, they walked out of the office and towards the courthouse steps, stepping directly into the heart of the storm they had created. The moment they stepped outside, the wall of noise hit them. It was a physical pressure, a chaotic blend of reporters shouting Congresswoman Crockett, the unified rhythmic chants of USA, USA, from across the street, and the frantic clicking of 100 camera shutters. For a split second, Samuel Carter flinched, his steps faltering on the pavement. Jasmine Crockett, without breaking stride or looking at him, simply said, "Just look at me, Samuel. Block out the rest. It's just you and me having a conversation." He focused on the back of her head, on the determined set of her shoulders, and matched her pace. They moved through the sea of media like a ship cutting through choppy water, a small island of purpose in an ocean of chaos, and ascended the 4 granite steps to the podium. Behind them, the volunteers followed with the dolly stacked high with the sealed plastic buckets of quarters. They placed one bucket at the foot of the podium, a squat, heavy symbol of the entire affair. Crockett adjusted the microphones, her movements deliberate and calm. She scanned the crowd of reporters, then looked past them to the protesters, making eye contact with a man holding a sign that depicted her with devil horns. She held his gaze for a beat, her expression unreadable, before turning back to the microphones. The cacophony died down to an expectant hush. "Good morning," she began, her voice crisp and clear, carrying easily in the dry air. She didn't shout, she compelled them to listen. "We are here today because of a choice made by a retired schoolteacher, Mr. Samuel Carter, who stands beside me. His choice was to leave bottled water on his own property for any person who might be dying of thirst. A choice to affirm basic human dignity." She paused, letting the simple words land. For this, he was cited under Texas Health and Safety Code, Section 343, a statute concerning illegal dumping. Let me be clear, the law was designed to stop people from dumping trash, not from offering life-sustaining water. Judge Wallace Thorne, an appointee of the former president, interpreted this law in a new and creative way. He fined Mr. Carter $1,000. When Mr. Carter refused to concede that his act of compassion was a crime, Judge Thorne found him in contempt of court, adding a penalty of $2,500 for a total of $3,500. She spoke like a lawyer, giving an opening statement to a jury methodical, precise, and unassailable. She was building a foundation of fact before she introduced the emotion. 2 days ago, President Donald Trump stood on a stage in Arizona, held up Mr. Carter's case as an example, and told a crowd of thousands that when people like Mr. Carter offer aid, we must make them pay. And for once, she leaned into the microphone, her voice dropping slightly. "I agree with him." A ripple of confusion went through the press corps. Across the street, the protesters cheered, thinking she was conceding the point. "We agree he should pay," Crockett continued, raising her voice again to cut through the noise. He should pay this unjust fine, and then he should be free from this unjust persecution. But he was not going to pay for it alone. The former president wanted to make an example of Mr. Carter. Well, we've made him an example too. An example of how this country responds when bullies try to weaponize the law against good people. A reporter from a national news network shouted the first question. "Congresswoman, your critics are calling this a political stunt. They say, you're using this man to score points against Donald Trump. How do you respond?" Crockett turned towards the reporter. "A stunt is when you invent a problem. We didn't invent this. Judge Thorne and his political patrons did. Stunt is when you use people as props. Mr. Trump used Samuel Carter as a prop to incite his base. I'm standing with him as a citizen to defend his rights. We are not here playing a game. We are here to settle a debt that never should have been levied in the first place." From across the street, a man with a bullhorn bellowed. He was aiding an invasion. "You're a traitor, Crockett. A traitor." Jasmine turned her body to face the protesters directly. The cameras swiveled to follow her gaze. "To the gentleman with the bullhorn," she said, her voice ringing with authority, "let me recommend a book. It's called The New Testament. You can read about a man who offered water to the thirsty and food to the hungry. In that book, he's the hero. In yours, apparently, he's a criminal. We stand with the Good Samaritan. You can stand with the Pharisees. The choice is yours." The bullhorn went silent. A few of the protesters shifted uncomfortably. She had turned their own professed values back on them. She then looked back at the press and said, "I think we've heard enough from politicians. I want you to hear from the man they tried to silence." She stepped back from the podium, giving the space to Samuel Carter. The retired teacher gripped the sides of the lectern, his knuckles white. He looked small against the backdrop of the massive courthouse. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice not as polished as Crockett's, but carrying an unmistakable power of its own. "I taught American history for 41 years, he began. "I taught that this country at its best is about looking out for your neighbor. It's about a sense of shared humanity. The folks crossing my land, they're not an idea. They're people. Their feet are bleeding and their children are crying. I didn't ask them where they were from. I just saw that they were thirsty. If that is a crime in the state of Texas today, then I am guilty and I would do it again tomorrow." He looked directly into the main camera. "I just hope that if it were your child, someone would give them a drink of water." He said nothing more. He simply stepped back, his part said. The raw honesty of his words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the political vitriol. Crockett stepped forward again, her face set like stone. This was the moment. "Mr. Trump wanted to make him pay," she declared, her voice rising with controlled fury. "So we did." She gestured to the bucket at her feet. "We launched the Quarters for Compassion campaign less than 36 hours ago," the American people responded, "not just with enough to pay this fine, but with enough to fund humanitarian charities on the border for months to come." She then knelt down, not breaking eye contact with the cameras. She plunged both hands into the bucket and lifted them high, letting thousands of quarters cascade through her fingers. The clinking, clattering sound, a metallic waterfall against the stunned silence. "This is the sound of compassion," she yelled. "This is the sound of a country that is better than this cruelty." She stood up. "This isn't a fine. It's a badge of honor, paid for by a community that still knows right from wrong." She turned to her volunteers. "All right, let's go pay the man." It was the signal. The press barrier nearly broke as reporters surged forward. The volunteers, flanked by the security guards, began the slow, laborious process of wheeling the dollies loaded with the heavy buckets up the courthouse steps and inside, an act of logistical defiance. Crockett took Samuel Carter by the arm and led him away from the podium, shielding him from the swarm of microphones and shouted questions, and disappeared into a waiting car. The moment the car door closed, the digital world exploded. The clip of Crockett letting the quarters fall through her fingers was everywhere. #Bajuvaner trended alongside #Quarters for Compassion. News alerts flashed on millions of phones. The split screens on cable news showed the live feed of volunteers hauling buckets into a federal building on one side, and on the other, Trump's campaign surrogates sputtering about disrespect for the law, their talking points rendered obsolete by the sheer power of the visual. Hours later, In the quiet of an anonymous El Paso hotel room, the adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep weariness. Jasmine Crockett kicked off her shoes and sank into a lumpy armchair, the television muted in the corner, replaying the scene she had just orchestrated. Her body ached, but it was a familiar ache, the cost of a righteous fight. Mel had taken Samuel Carter to a safe location where he would stay until the immediate storm blew over. David was handling the media calls. For the first time in 2 days, she was alone. She picked up her personal phone. The screen was a nightmare. Hundreds of notifications. She ignored the endless stream of supportive messages and did what she always did. She looked at the enemy's fire. She opened her texts and voicemails from unknown numbers. The hatred was raw, immediate, and deeply personal. "We know where you live, you race-baiting bee asterisk, 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 asterisk. You think you're so smart with your little stunt. You're gonna get what's coming to you. Just you wait." One voicemail wasn't even words, just a man breathing heavily. Then whispering the name of her younger sister, she closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe. This was the part nobody saw. The victory on the courthouse steps felt a million miles away. This was the private tax on public service, a price extracted in fear and intimidation. She scrolled through the blocked numbers until she saw one she recognized, her mother. Her finger trembled slightly as she hit the call button. "Jasmine Marie Crockett, are you out of your mind?" The voice was a mixture of anger and terror. It was the voice of every mother who has ever seen their child step into danger. "Hi, Mama," Jasmine said, her own voice suddenly feeling very small. "I saw you on the news. I saw those ... those people screaming at you. And your phone. I tried calling your phone. It went straight to voicemail. I'd been sick with worry." "You okay?" "I'm okay, Mama. I'm safe. I'm just ... tired. Tired. Baby, this is more than tired. I get the voicemails too. You know, they find my number. They call my house, telling me what they want to do to my daughter." Her mother's voice broke. "Is it worth it, Jas? Is this fight worth all this ugliness?" Jasmine leaned her head back against the chair, the threats from the voicemails echoing in her ears, now amplified by her mother's pain. For a fleeting moment, she wondered the same thing. She thought of a quiet life, a law practice, a world without threats and bullhorns. Then she thought of Samuel Carter's face, the quiet dignity in his voice when he said, "I just hope that if it were your child, someone would give them a drink of water." "Yes, Mama," she whispered into the phone, the certainty returning to her. Voice rebuilding her from the inside out, "It's worth it. Because if we let them win, if we let them make us too scared to be decent, then what's left? We can't let them make us as small as they are." She listened as her mother cried, a sound that hurt more than any death threat. She promised to call again in the morning, promised to have her security team check in. After they hung up, she sat in the silent hotel room for a long time, the weight of the Datha, public triumph, and the private terror settling upon her. The fight was won, but the war, she knew, was far from over. In the week that followed the confrontation in El Paso, the story metastasized across the American political landscape. The two Americas, walled off from one another by algorithm and ideology, consumed two entirely different narratives. On one side, Jasmine Crockett was a folk hero. Activist groups sold T-shirts emblazoned with badge of honor. Teachers shared Samuel Carter's speech in their classrooms. The co-R&T of the cascading quarters became a ubiquitous GIF, a symbol of joyful defiance. Donations to the border charities she had highlighted skyrocketed. Crockett had successfully captured the moral high ground, and her supporters celebrated the victory with relentless digital enthusiasm. On the other side, the narrative was one of desecration and anarchy. Donald Trump, never one to let an attack go unanswered, used a rally in South Carolina to escalate his assault. "You saw this radical left Congresswoman from Texas, a disgrace," he roared to a sea of supporters. "She went down there with a bucket of change, like a beggar, to make a mockery of a great judge, a patriot. She sides with the criminals, with the invaders, over our own laws. It's disgusting." The crowd booed on cue. Online, the attacks were more targeted. Crockett's personal details were spread across dark corners of the web. Judge Thorne was lionized. As a martyr for the rule of law, Samuel Carter was portrayed as a senile pawn in a cynical political game. The battle lines were drawn, and the conflict settled into a predictable, grinding war of attrition, with each side lobbing rhetorical grenades from the safety of their respective media bunkers. The story was in danger of becoming just another fleeting episode in the endless culture war. Then, on a Tuesday morning, the battlefield shifted unexpectedly. The change came not from a politician or a pundit, but from a source so respected by the conservative legal establishment that it could not be ignored. Judge Lawrence Von Men, who had been appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals by Ronald Reagan and had retired after 30 years on the bench, published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. Von was a legend in Federalist Society circles, a man whose belief in judicial restraint and textual originalism was beyond reproach. He was, in every sense, the ideological opposite of what Judge Wallace Thorn aspired to be. The title of his piece was simple and devastating: a betrayal of conservative principles. Von's op-ed was a masterclass in legal evisceration. He never once mentioned Jasmine Crockett or Donald Trump. He focused entirely on the law. The conservative legal movement, to which I have dedicated my life, he began, is predicated on a simple idea that judges are to interpret the law as it is written, not as they wish it to be. They are umpires, not players. The recent ruling by a federal magistrate in Texas, however, represents a profound and dangerous departure from this principle. He dismantled Judge Thorn's reasoning piece by piece. The statute in question concerning illegal dumping is plain in its intent and language. To twist its meaning to prosecute an act of providing water is not a strict interpretation. It is a grotesque caricature of one. This is not originalism. It is outcome-driven sophistry. It is the very definition of judicial activism that conservatives have spent 50 years fighting against. He invoked the legal principle of lex certa, the doctrine that a law must be clear enough for an ordinary person to understand what is prohibited. A citizen cannot be expected to obey the law if the law can be contorted at a moment's notice to criminalize any act a judge finds distasteful. Von wrote, "To sanction Mr. Samuel Carter under this statute is to embrace a legal standard so vague and arbitrary that it would make King James I blush. It replaces the rule of law with the rule of whim. This is not conservatism. It is a step towards tyranny." The op-ed landed like a bombshell. It was too erudite for Trump's base to fully grasp, but its impact on the political and legal class was immense. Conservative senators who had been silent or had offered tepid support for Judge Thorn were suddenly put on the spot. They could no longer frame it as a simple matter of being tough on the border. Now, they had to answer for supporting a ruling that one of their own intellectual titans had just branded as a liberal-style abuse of judicial power. Von's intervention gave them the cover they needed. They could now criticize the ruling. Without validating Crockett's methods, the cable news narrative fractured. Panels that had previously featured screaming matches between partisans now included sober legal scholars debating the finer points of statutory interpretation. The conversation shifted from Crockett's stunt to Thorn's overreach. The pressure mounted not on the Congresswoman, but on the judge and the legal framework that had enabled him. The Texas Bar Association announced it was opening an inquiry into a formal complaint filed against Judge Thorn, citing Judge Von's column as a significant factor. It was in this new, more serious climate that Jasmine Crockett received the invitation. It wasn't for a fiery cable news debate, but for a long-form interview on a respected Sunday morning public affairs show, the kind that prided itself on thoughtful, in-depth discussion. This was her chance to move beyond the soundbites and define the principle she had fought for. On her own terms, she sat opposite the host, a veteran journalist known for his calm demeanor and incisive questions. The studio was quiet, a world away from the chaos on the courthouse steps. Crockett was not the fiery warrior from El Paso. She was the focused, formidable lawyer. She wore a simple, dark blue dress. Her demeanor was composed, her arguments precise. "Congresswoman," the host began, "the events in El Paso have been called many things. Now that the dust has settled, and with figures like Judge Von weighing in, how do you see what happened?" Crockett looked directly at the camera, not as if speaking to a journalist, but as if addressing a national jury. "What happened in El Paso was a symptom of a larger disease," she said, her voice even and measured. "For years, we've seen a political strategy that seeks to dehumanize people for political gain. It's a strategy that requires us to see a thirsty human being, not as a person, but as a threat, as an invader. And to enforce that worldview, they have to bend and ultimately break the rule of law. She continued, "I am grateful for Judge Vaughn's courageous and principled stand. He is a conservative, and I am a progressive Democrat. We likely disagree on 99 out of 100 issues, but he and I, and millions of Americans across the political spectrum, agree on one fundamental thing. The law must mean what it says. It cannot be a cudgel for bullies. A judge's robe is not a political jersey you put on to help your team score points. It is a sacred trust. And Judge Thorne violated that trust," the host pushed back gently. "But your critics, and indeed President Trump, would say that you engaged in political theater yourself, that the quarters, the press conference, was all designed to provoke." Crockett nodded, accepting the premise of the question before dismantling it. "Theater is used to reveal a truth, and the truth we revealed is that the compassion of the American people is a far more powerful force than the cruelty of a few politicians. We didn't just pay a fine, we held up a mirror. And what it reflected was that most Americans, regardless of their party, believe that giving a thirsty person a drink of water is an act of grace, not a crime. The quarters were not a stunt. They were a petition, signed by thousands of people, demanding that we live up to our own declared values." She then delivered her closing argument, the lines she had been refining in her mind all week. This was never a fight about one man or one law. It was a fight for the soul of our country. It was a test to see if we are a nation that is governed by laws or by fear, a test to see if our bedrock principles of justice and decency are just words we recite, or if they are living things we are willing to fight for. The people of this country, with their quarters and their courage, showed that they are willing to fight, and as long as they are, I believe the rule of law and our better angels will always win." Her statement was definitive. She had taken a chaotic partisan brawl and elevated it into a clear, resonant defense of American ideals. She had used her opponent's attack to pivot to higher ground, and thanks to an ally she had never met, she had been able to frame the final, lasting argument not in the language of politics, but in the unassailable language of principle. The fallout from Judge Vaughn's op-ed and Crockett's subsequent interview was swift and decisive. Politics, like nature, abhors a vacuum, but it also despises a losing argument. With the legal ground crumbling beneath them, the political support for Judge Thorne evaporated. In Austin, the Speaker of the Texas House, a moderate Republican, feeling the heat from influential pro-business lobbyists who hated the negative national attention, announced the formation of a special bipartisan committee. Its stated purpose was to clarify and modernize the language of several state public health codes, including the one used against Samuel Carter to prevent future misapplications. It was a classic political face-saving maneuver, but it was also a tangible victory. The weapon used against Samuel Carter was being dismantled. Simultaneously, the Chief Judge of the Fifth Circuit quietly reassigned Judge Thorne from all criminal and civil dockets to administrative duties pending the full review by the Texas Bar. He wasn't fired, he wasn't sanctioned, but he was benched. His days of making headlines from the bench were over. The national storm moved on to its next outrage, the news cycle churning forward, leaving the events in El Paso to fade into political memory. But the echo of the falling quarters of Samuel Carter's quiet dignity, of Jasmine Crockett's defiant stand, lingered. It traveled through fiber optic cables and satellite signals, a ripple of civic energy that eventually found its way to a cluttered apartment in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And to a 28-year-old graphic designer named Sarah Dott, Sarah was the dictionary definition of politically disengaged. She voted in presidential elections, but she had long since succumbed to a weary cynicism. To her, politics was a toxic spectator sport played by millionaires and angry ideologues on television, a game that had no connection to her life, her rent, or her student loan payments. It was all just noise, a constant barrage of outrage designed to make her feel powerless and small. She'd spend her evenings scrolling through her phone, a mix of escapist design blogs and anxiety-inducing headlines flying past her thumb, each post deepening her sense of detachment, One evening, a week after the media had mostly moved on, her phone's algorithm served her a clip. It wasn't the fiery press conference, but the quiet Sunday interview with Jasmine Crockett. Sarah almost swiped past it, but the headline, "Congresswoman on the Real Meaning of the Quarters for Compassion." Protest made her pause. She tapped play, expecting the usual talking points and partisan attacks. Instead, she heard Crockett's.com measured voice talking not about Democrats and Republicans, but about the rule of law and the definition of decency. She heard the argument that the fight was about preventing bullies from weaponizing the law. It was an idea that cut through her cynicism because it wasn't about a party. It was about a principle. Intrigued, she fell down a rabbit hole. She found the full press conference. She watched Samuel Carter grip the podium, his voice trembling but firm, as he talked about the simple act of giving someone a drink of water. Then she watched the moment with the quarters. She had seen the GIF, of course, but in context, it felt different. It wasn't just a clever stunt. She saw it for what Crockett had called it, a petition. Every single one of those 140,000 quarters represented a person who, like her, probably felt small and powerless on their own, but who had been given a chance to add their little piece of metal to the pile. The weight of the bucket wasn't just physical, it was the collective weight of thousands of small acts of defiance. It was the first time in years that a political act had made her feel something other than despair. It made her feel a flicker of hope. The next day, that flicker was still there. While scrolling through a local news site, she saw a short article about the Allentown Community Food Bank. Their volunteer numbers were down 40% since the pandemic, and they were having to reduce their opening hours, turning away families who relied on them. A quote from the 70-year-old director, a woman named Maria, was heartbreaking. "We have the food," she'd said. "We just don't have the hands to sort it, or the people to give it out." A month ago, Sarah would have felt a pang of sadness and swiped on, but the image of the quarters was stuck in her head. Small things, when gathered together, could have wait. She thought about her own skills. She couldn't solve the whole problem, but she could do something. That afternoon, instead of working on a freelance project, she opened her design software. She created a simple, powerful graphic. It was a picture of an empty hand reaching out with the text, "Your neighbors are hungry. Lend a hand." Below it, she put the food bank's address, its new, reduced hours, and a big, bold call for volunteers. It was clean, professional, and took her about an hour. She posted it to her personal Instagram, then shared it in a few local Allentown community groups on Facebook with a short, personal message. "I just read that our local food bank is struggling for volunteers. I'm not a community organizer, but I can make a flyer. I'm going to volunteer for a shift this Saturday morning. If anyone wants to join, let me know. Maybe we can be the hands they need." She didn't expect much, maybe a few likes, but the post was shared, then shared again. People started commenting. "I can be there Saturday. My son and I will come. I can't do Saturday, but I signed up for a shift next Tuesday." It was like a digital version of the quarters piling up, small commitments adding up to something real. The final scene of the story takes place on a bright, chilly Saturday morning outside the Allentown Community Food Bank. Maria, the director, stands on the loading dock, her jaw slightly agape. Instead of the 3 volunteers she was expecting, there are nearly 30 people milling about, drinking coffee from paper cups and waiting for instructions. It's a diverse crowd: college students, young parents with kids in tow, a few retirees. In the middle of it all is Sarah. She's holding a clipboard, looking slightly overwhelmed, but also energized in a way she hasn't felt in years. She's not giving a speech or leading a protest. She's just a person with a clipboard, directing a man twice her age where to stack boxes of canned goods. She had just taken one small, achievable step, and in doing so, had transformed from a passive spectator into an active participant. She had created her own small pile of quarters. The fight on the Texas border had felt a million miles away, a battle of giants, but its echo had traveled all the way to Pennsylvania, not as a political slogan, but as a simple, powerful reminder. You don't have to be a congresswoman to stand up for your community. You just have to be willing to lend a hand. What does it truly mean to fight for what you believe in? Is it about winning the argument on TV, or is it about the small, unseen actions that change a community? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that go beyond the headlines.